I have watched enough American presidencies up close to recognize the moment when power stops feeling routine and begins to feel brittle. That moment rarely announces itself with a single decision. It emerges when resistance stops being episodic and becomes ambient, when protests are no longer isolated events but a constant background noise to governance. In the current climate, the backlash against immigration and customs enforcement has taken on that quality. It is not simply opposition to a policy instrument, it is a challenge to the legitimacy of federal authority itself. When crowds gather outside detention facilities, when local governments refuse cooperation, and when governors openly resist federal enforcement priorities, the presidency begins to experience pressure not as criticism but as constraint. The executive branch still holds formal authority, but its ability to exercise that authority without escalation diminishes. Every enforcement action risks provoking a broader confrontation. Every retreat appears as a weakness. That is the space where panic can creep in, not emotional panic, but strategic panic, the sense that ordinary tools no longer work. Presidents who thrive under these conditions usually de-escalate, absorb the resistance, and seek institutional compromise. Presidents who do not often look upward toward exceptional powers that promise speed and decisiveness. The Insurrection Act sits there, rarely used, constitutionally dangerous, but legally available, a reminder that the American system still contains emergency levers designed for moments when civil order appears to be slipping. The mere consideration of such tools is itself revealing. It signals that governance has shifted from persuasion to containment. At the same time, elections, normally the system's release valve, begin to look less like solutions and more like threats. When legitimacy erodes, the ballot can feel unpredictable rather than stabilizing. Leaders under pressure may talk about fraud, chaos, or delay, not because those conditions are proven, but because uncertainty itself becomes a governing problem. The presidency, designed to be strong yet bounded, starts testing those bounds. This is not yet the collapse of the democratic order. It is something more subtle and more familiar in comparative politics. A presidency confronting resistance it cannot easily control, tempted to treat dissent as disorder and procedure as an obstacle. History shows that this is the point at which systems either re-anchor themselves in consent or begin to drift toward rule by force. Immigration enforcement has always occupied a unique and volatile position in American governance. It sits at the intersection of federal supremacy, local autonomy, and human consequence. When immigration customs enforcement was expanded after 2003, it was designed to professionalize and centralize enforcement following the reorganization of Homeland Security. Over time, however, ICE became something else entirely. Not merely an agency, but a symbol of how the state exercises coercive power over people with limited political voice. That symbolism matters. In democratic systems, enforcement agencies rely not only on statutory authority, but on a minimum level of social consent. When that consent fractures, enforcement stops being administrative and starts becoming confrontational. Sanctuary policies, state-level resistance, and mass protests did not arise because the law suddenly changed, but because the lived consequences of enforcement, family separation, prolonged detention, opaque procedures collided with evolving public norms and demographic realities. What had once been tolerated as necessary enforcement came to be experienced as moral overreach. From inside government, this creates a dilemma with no clean exit. Retreating from enforcement invites accusations of lawlessness and abdication of duty. Escalating enforcement risks deepening resistance and transforming localized disputes into national crises. Federalism complicates this further. Governors, mayors, and state attorneys general are not subordinate administrators. They are independently elected actors with their own legitimacy. When they refuse cooperation, the federal government can compel compliance only by invoking extraordinary authority, and every such move raises the political temperature. This is how immigration enforcement becomes a flashpoint rather than a policy domain. It concentrates multiple anxieties at once: cultural change, economic insecurity, national identity, and the reach of executive power. For a presidency already under pressure, ICE becomes both shield and lightning rod. Defending it is framed as defending order, criticizing it is framed as undermining sovereignty. Neither framing resolves the underlying problem, which is that enforcement without consent erodes the very authority it seeks to assert. History offers a consistent lesson here. States that rely increasingly on visible coercion to implement contested policies do not restore legitimacy, they spend it. Immigration enforcement, when detached from broader institutional compromise, stops stabilizing governance and starts testing its limits. That is when policy hardens into posture, and posture drifts toward force. The Insurrection Act occupies a peculiar place in American law. It is both narrow and expansive, obscure yet potent. Passed in the early republic and amended across centuries, it allows a president to deploy federal troops inside the United States when state authorities are unwilling or unable to protect constitutional rights or suppress domestic disorder. It was written for emergencies that threaten the survival of the Union, not for moments of political inconvenience. And yet, because it remains on the books, it exerts a quiet gravitational pull on executives facing resistance they cannot otherwise manage. Historically, its use has been rare and revealing. Eisenhower invoked it in Little Rock to enforce desegregation against defiant state officials. Lyndon Johnson used it during the Civil Rights era when violence overwhelmed local authorities. In each case, the act was justified as a last resort to uphold constitutional order against local obstruction. The legitimacy of those deployments rested not on force alone, but on a broader national consensus that federal intervention was morally and legally necessary. That consensus is precisely what is absent in moments of contemporary temptation. When a president considers the Insurrection Act amid protests against federal policy itself, rather than against lawless rebellion, the legal authority may exist, but the political foundation does not. The act does not distinguish cleanly between restoring order and suppressing dissent. It relies on presidential judgment, and that is its danger. What was designed as an emergency brake can become an accelerant if pulled too easily. From inside government, the temptation is understandable. Courts move slowly. Congress is divided. State cooperation is uneven. The act promises immediacy. It bypasses negotiation and substitutes command. But history shows that once troops appear in domestic political conflicts, the character of governance shifts. The question stops being whether authority exists and becomes whether legitimacy survives. The Insurrection Act tests not only the president who considers invoking it, but the entire constitutional culture around them. Advisors, military leaders, governors, and judges all become participants in the decision whether they consent or resist. In that sense, the act is less a tool than a mirror. It reflects how fragile consent has become and how quickly power, when cornered, reaches for instruments that were never meant to be routine. Emergency powers rarely announce themselves as a break with democracy. They present instead as temporary measures, bounded responses to exceptional circumstances, framed as necessary to preserve order so that normal politics can resume. That logic is seductive precisely because it sounds responsible. I have seen it invoked at the state level during natural disasters, public health crises, and moments of civil unrest. The difference is not in the language of necessity, but in what follows once those powers are activated. When a government normalizes emergency authority to manage political dissent, the line between governance and control begins to blur. The deployment of force changes incentives across the system. Law enforcement becomes less accountable to civilian mediation and more responsive to executive command. Protest, once protected as expression, is reclassified as disruption. Opposition is no longer something to be answered, but something to be contained. Each step may be legally defensible in isolation. Together, they begin to hollow out democratic practice. The erosion is often incremental. Courts hesitate to intervene in what executives frame as security matters. Legislatures defer, unwilling to appear weak during disorder. Media coverage shifts from policy substance to scenes of confrontation. In that environment, elections lose their role as conflict-resolving mechanisms and start to look like stress tests that the system may not survive. Leaders under pressure begin to argue that stability must come before participation, that rights can wait until order is restored. History, both American and comparative, is unambiguous on this point. Democracies rarely collapse through a single authoritarian decree. They erode through the repeated use of extraordinary measures to address ordinary political conflict. Each invocation lowers the threshold for the next. What was once unthinkable becomes arguable. What was arguable becomes acceptable. Institutions remain standing, but their spirit changes. The danger is not only what emergency powers allow a president to do, but what they teach the system to tolerate. Once citizens become accustomed to soldiers and civic disputes, to postponed procedures, to executive discretion replacing collective judgment, restoring trust becomes far harder than imposing order ever was. Emergency governance solves the immediate problem of resistance, but it creates a longer-term crisis of legitimacy. This is the trade-off that leaders under pressure often underestimate. Force can quiet a moment. It cannot rebuild consent. And without consent, democratic systems do not fail loudly. They thin out slowly until power remains, but democracy does not. Elections are supposed to be the system's corrective mechanism when policy fails, when legitimacy erodes, when public anger accumulates. The ballot offers a peaceful reset, but that assumption only holds when those in power still trust the process to produce an outcome they can live with. Under sustained pressure, elections can begin to look less like a release valve and more like an accelerant, an event that might deepen instability rather than resolve it. I have seen how quickly confidence in electoral processes can be reframed. It rarely begins with an outright rejection of voting itself. It starts with claims about disorder, fraud, or administrative failure. The language is careful, procedural, almost managerial. The implication is not that elections are illegitimate in principle, but that this election, under these conditions, cannot be trusted. Once that framing takes hold, delay becomes prudence, interference becomes oversight, and outcomes become negotiable. For a presidency already struggling to enforce contested policies, elections introduce uncertainty at precisely the moment when control feels most necessary. Campaigns amplify dissent, turnout mobilizes opposition, ballots quantify discontent in a way protests do not. From the inside, that visibility can feel dangerous. Leaders begin to calculate not how elections restore legitimacy, but how they might strip it away. In that mindset, managing elections becomes a security problem rather than a democratic obligation. This is where democratic erosion accelerates. When executives treat electoral accountability as a threat, they search for alternatives, questioning results in advance, narrowing access, transferring authority to loyal institutions, or invoking emergency conditions that justify exceptional oversight. None of these steps requires canceling elections outright. They only require surrounding them with enough doubt, delay, and procedural friction that their capacity to settle disputes is weakened. The deeper irony is that avoiding electoral risk rarely produces stability. Systems that sideline elections lose their primary source of consent. Opposition does not disappear, it radicalizes. Governance becomes reactive, dependent on enforcement rather than legitimacy. What began as an attempt to preserve order ends by undermining the only mechanism capable of renewing it. Elections are disruptive by design. They redistribute power without force. When leaders come to fear that disruption, it signals not just political vulnerability, but a deeper break between authority and consent. At that point, the problem is no longer who wins an election, but whether elections are still allowed to matter. American democracy does not rely on a single guardian. It survives through a web of institutions, each designed to restrain the others while retaining its own legitimacy. Courts interpret, legislatures authorize, states administer, and the military obeys civilian command while remaining politically neutral. Under ordinary conditions, this architecture feels durable, almost automatic. Under stress, its fragility becomes visible. When executive power expands in response to dissent, institutions are forced to choose between resistance and accommodation. Courts may issue narrow rulings, hesitant to confront a president directly on matters framed as security or emergency. Legislatures, polarized and procedurally constrained, struggle to act collectively, often defaulting to silence or symbolic opposition. State governments push back where they can, but their tools are uneven and their exposure high. Each institution calculates risk independently, and that fragmentation is itself a vulnerability. The most consequential restraint often lies outside formal law, in norms. The expectation that military leaders will refuse unlawful orders, that civil servants will prioritize legality over loyalty, that election officials will certify results regardless of pressure. These are not enforced by statute alone. They depend on professional culture and public backing. Once those norms are tested repeatedly, they weaken. Officials begin to ask not what is right, but what is survivable. Resistance, when it occurs, is rarely dramatic. It shows up as delay, resignation, cautious dissent, or quiet noncompliance. These acts matter, but they are also limited. Institutions are designed to slow power, not to confront it outright. If pressure persists long enough, attrition sets in, personnel change, rules are reinterpreted. What once would have triggered a crisis becomes routine. This is the paradox of institutional fragility. The system can absorb extraordinary stress without collapsing, but absorption is not the same as health. Each accommodation leaves a residue, trust erodes, precedent shifts. The next confrontation starts from a weaker baseline. From a governing perspective, this is the most dangerous phase. Power still functions, courts still sit, elections still occur, and yet the stabilizing confidence that binds them together thins. Institutions have not failed, but they have been bent. And history suggests that once democratic systems reach this stage, recovery depends less on legal repair than on political will, on whether leaders choose to rebuild consent or continue governing against resistance. Every political system eventually confronts the same test, whether authority can endure when consent weakens. The American system is no exception. Its designers assume conflict, ambition, and fear would always exist, which is why they layered power, slowed decision-making, and tied legitimacy to elections. But those mechanisms only function when leaders accept that consent is not a nuisance to be managed, but the substance of governance itself. When power operates without consent, it does not immediately collapse. In fact, it often becomes more efficient in the short term. Orders move faster, resistance is deterred, uncertainty is suppressed. From the inside, that efficiency can feel like relief. Yet it comes at a cost that is structural rather than tactical. Each act of coercion substitutes compliance for agreement. Each bypassed institution narrows the space where legitimacy is renewed. Over time, the system becomes dependent on force, not because it prefers it, but because it has exhausted alternatives. What history makes clear is that this trajectory is difficult to reverse once normalized. Leaders who govern through emergency powers inherit a public that no longer trusts ordinary procedures. Institutions adapt to pressure rather than principle. Elections lose their capacity to resolve conflict and instead become triggers for it. At that stage, even a change in leadership does not automatically restore democratic health. The damage is not personal, it is systemic. The lesson is not that power should never be asserted. States must enforce laws, protect order, and defend constitutional boundaries. The lesson is that power untethered from consent eventually undermines its own foundation. Authority survives not because it can compel obedience, but because enough people believe its outcomes are legitimate even when they lose. In moments of backlash and panic, the temptation is to treat dissent as a threat to be neutralized rather than a signal to be addressed. That choice defines trajectories. Systems that respond by doubling down on coercion may endure for a time, but they hollow out from within. Systems that re-anchor themselves in accountability and restraint absorb conflict without converting it into crisis. Power can silence opposition, only consent can stabilize it. When leaders forget that distinction, they may retain control, but they stop governing in the democratic sense of the word. And that, more than any single decision or statute, is how democratic decline takes root, not with a coup, but with a gradual acceptance that force is easier than persuasion and that survival matters more than legitimacy.